Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Revolution, a tax on the wealthy elite, and a promise to be the party of the workers. There were moments when Theresa May sounded like she might be addressing a gathering of the socialist workers rather than the Conservative Party conference in Birmingham. She told her party faithful that following the European referendum, the country had to change. She wanted capitalism to be fairer and to work for ordinary working class people rather than the rich and powerful. Our political editor Gary Gibbon watched the speech.
Theresa May believes she's become Prime Minister of an angry nation. The referendum threw light on resentments bottled up for years. The super-rich were having it too much their own way. Some immigrants were undercutting pay. It all meant there was a new centre ground in British politics, and it wasn't where David Cameron thought it was. She began with a joke about one prominent member of her team, after first pausing to take it all in.
When we came to Birmingham this week, some big questions were hanging in the air. Do we have a plan for Brexit? We do. Are we ready for the effort it will take to see it through? We are. Can Boris Johnson stay on message for a full 4 days?
Brexit Secretary David Davis, no big fan, loved that. Boris Johnson heckled, "I've been slavish."
I've been slavish.
For years, David Cameron and George Osborne had told conferences that those with the broadest shoulders had been bearing the burdens of the banking crisis. Theresa May sees it differently. She said the Brexit vote was an uprising against inequality.
Knock on almost any door in almost any part of the country, and you will find the roots of that revolution laid bare. The roots of the revolution run deep, because it wasn't the wealthy who made the biggest sacrifices after the financial crisis, but ordinary working-class families. And if you're one of those people who lost their job, who stayed in work but on reduced hours, took a pay cut as household bills rocketed, or, and I know a lot of people don't like to admit this, someone who finds themselves out of work or on lower wages because of low-skilled immigration, life simply doesn't seem fair. It feels like your dreams have been sacrificed in the service of others. So change has got to come. Because if we don't respond, if we don't take this opportunity to deliver the change people want, resentments will grow, divisions will become entrenched, and that would be a disaster for Britain.
Mrs May believes the referendum was a cry of pain from the masses, resentful of how politicians have repeatedly let bosses and big companies get away with murder.
So if you're a boss who earns a fortune but doesn't look after your staff, an international company that treats tax laws as an optional extra, a household name that refuses to work with the authorities even to fight terrorism, a director who takes out massive dividends while knowing that the company pension is about to go bust. I'm putting you on warning. This can't go on anymore. A change has got to come, and this party is going to make it.
She didn't name names, but it sounded like Facebook, Google, Amazon, Sports Direct, Philip Green were in her sights. She reached out to disenchanted working-class voters and said she wasn't like the politicians they loathed.
They find your patriotism distasteful, your concerns about immigration parochial, your views about crime illiberal, your attachment to your job security inconvenient. They find the fact that more than 17 million voters decided to leave the European Union simply bewildering. Because if you're well off and comfortable, Britain is a different country, and these concerns are not your concerns. It's easy to dismiss them, easy to say that all you want from government is for it to get out of the way. But a change has got to come. It's time to remember the good that government can do.
Mrs May wants government to do more in areas like controlling energy bills, building roads, boosting housing for the less well-off. The exact policies here aren't yet cooked. She sounded an alarm bell against more quantitative easing measures, which were hurting savers and had had their day.
Come with me as we rise to meet this moment. Come with me, and together, let's seize the day.
The music was Mr Blue Sky, but Theresa May painted a cloud-laden landscape, a damaged, pained, unequal country at a turning point, in grave danger of tipping into populism unless massive change was embraced. There were echoes of Labour on the rich, of UKIP on immigration, some even of her former boss, David Cameron. She'd been with Mr Cameron on the Remain side in the referendum. She was now vaulting the barricades to try to put herself at the front of the angry mob. Only 8% of her speech was devoted to how Britain leaves Europe, but it'll suck in a mighty share of her time, and it'll dictate the political and economic weather for years to come. Gary Gibbon, Channel 4 News at the Conservative Party conference in Birmingham.
So, Theresa May's speech was a direct appeal to the Brexit majority, the families of those parts of Britain who supposedly feel shut out by the establishment and shunned by the elite, and to the ordinary working class. A long time since we heard class distinctions from a Conservative leader. But did her message resonate? Our correspondent Kieran Jenkins has been trying to find out.
It's what I'm in this for, to put the power of government squarely at the service of ordinary working class people.
As Theresa May stood up and told working people what she thinks they wanted to hear, John, floor manager, remained sceptical.
I believe that the government don't really stand up for the working class.
When you see Theresa May, do you feel that, yeah, that's someone on my level, on my wavelength? She really means it when she says she's backing me?
Not really. As with all politicians, the proof's in the pudding. Let's see what you actually do before you start spouting off about you're going to work for the working class.
Around 100 people are employed here at this Birmingham business making engine components. This week they are beginning to get a sense of what post-Brexit Britain might look and feel like.
It's a pretty multinational workforce you've got here, is it?
Absolutely, yes. We very much embrace diversity here.
Right. So
For HR manager Sonia, it might mean, following the Home Secretary's speech, having to list all her foreign workers.
If they want to look at the demographics of the business, I've got no issue about disclosing that information.
What if someone turned around and said to you, you employ too many foreigners, your foreign quota is too high?
What constitutes too high?
Exactly.
Yeah, so the fact is that we're a successful business, we employ people who do the best job. So for me, I just wouldn't pursue any further conversation about that.
Radu, from Romania, knows a lot of the chat at the Tory conference is about workers just like him.
What do you think about all the messages coming from the politicians saying there must be jobs first for British workers?
Well, the thing is, they're actually making the people act worse against us. I don't know, why did they let us come in the first place?
We are the party of workers.
Less than a mile from the Prime Minister's podium, we meet a young couple that might have come straight out of her script.
You want to get a better job, do you?
Yeah, I really want a better job.
Are you someone that politicians and prime ministers you think look out for,
No.
care about?
No, we're just pushed under the carpet. We're just pushed under the carpet, man.
To truly be the party of workers will mean transforming places like this, a task as big as Brexit. Theresa May believes she can do both jobs at once.
And later in the programme, we'll be hearing from the Defence Secretary Michael Fallon as he marks the start of production on Britain's new fleet of Trident submarines.
From the Tory conference, the Defence Secretary Michael Fallon has symbolically cut the steel for the multi-billion-pound fleet of new submarines which will carry the Trident missile system. And he defended his decision to use steel supplied by France. But as he visited the BAE Systems site in Barrow, Sir Michael insisted the majority of new vessels would be British-built, as Paul McNamara reports.
As metaphors go, this is a rather fitting way to start construction on one of the most emotive and hotly debated projects the government has committed to. This is the first steel plate of the first Trident nuclear deterrent submarine being pressed, a moment worthy of the Defence Secretary Sir Michael Fallon, although not worthy, it seems, of British steel. Almost half of the steel on the first boat built by Brexit Britain will be French.
Well, there wasn't a British bid for that particular type of steel, but let me reassure you, 85% of these boats, the content of these submarines, will be built here in Britain, and there will be firms involved in this £31 billion investment, firms as far apart from Scotland, the northeast of England, the northwest, the Midlands, the southeast, will all get a share of this project.
So why wasn't there a British bid on this? Was British Steel not up to the job?
The British companies didn't tender for that particular type of steel, but there will be plenty of British content in these submarines.
5,000 people work at BAE Systems here in Barrow, and Trident Renewal has secured their futures. It's not just lives, but livelihoods reliant on jobs being done right in this economically downtrodden corner of Cumbria. These are the submarines being replaced, cutting-edge tech in their time. But for all our military might, Britain is still powerless to stop the suffering in many conflicts around the world. Conflicts like Syria.
We're working extremely hard to get a political settlement that will stop the civil war, but also, of course,
that looks
to tackle
like a stalemate
Daesh.
at the moment, so we're not doing anything to end all of the suffering in Aleppo.
Well, we are trying to persuade Russia to use its influence. It's Russia that controls the regime, has huge influence there. We are trying to persuade the Russians to get the Assad regime to stop bombing its own people, to allow humanitarian aid convoys in. We are also, of course, in Syria tackling Daesh, which is a very direct threat to this country, and we want to ensure that Daesh is properly defeated in both Iraq and Syria.
Today, work started on submarines which will launch in a decade and sail the seas for decades more. But it seems there's no timeline for solutions to the conflicts of today.
Don't sound so enthusiastic.
Oh, I am. Now, Theresa May is splashed across almost all the front pages, all except Alistair's old paper, the Daily Mirror. The Telegraph headline is, "It's time to remember the good that government can do." The Mail says, "We're coming after you," in reference to Mrs May's message to tax-avoiding multinationals and energy giants. The Guardian declares that May has consigned Cameron to history. And the Times headline says, "May takes centre stage in appeal to Labour voters." Well, someone who knows all about staking out the centre ground is you, Alistair Campbell. Do you agree she now owns that territory?
No, and I don't think she should be allowed to either, because I think that a lot of what she's said and done since she took office and stood on the steps of Downing Street is actually at odds with the sentiments that she set out then. I think it's been a very odd week. Seeing Amber Rudd, who I was campaigning with during the referendum campaign, coming out with that stuff about making foreign companies list foreign workers, Jeremy Hunt trying to suggest that if only we could get rid of a few foreign doctors and get a few more Brits in there. I thought it was becoming borderline and even crossing at times xenophobia as opposed to patriotism.
We're going to talk about that a bit later on. But in general, she is sort of parking her tanks on the lawn that people might have said Tony Blair occupied, because there's no one else there at the moment.
Well, I think she's doing two things.
Jeremy Corbyn's vacated it. UKIP on the other side are obviously in disarray. So she's got plenty of room to manoeuvre.
No, and I think what she was doing, actually, there were parts of it. I know you've got Alistair Heath from the Telegraph coming on later, and I've read his column today where he's really talking about how he feels she's trying to get too far over to the left, say, on business. But I think in other parts of it, it really was the whole thing, the feel of the week has felt like a sort of UKIP tribute band. And I think that, so she's doing both. She's trying to park her tanks on Labour's lawns, but also on UKIP. And I think that's quite a difficult thing to do.
It is, but she has been quite successful when it comes to Labour, to the Labour side. I mean, Jeremy Corbyn has drawn criticism because we haven't heard anything from him all week. I mean, there has been no counter-argument being put forward by Labour. Do you agree?
I do, and
should he have been more visible?
Well, I think that it's not just about the leadership of the Labour Party, but I think there's, back in the day when I was a journalist, there was this kind of thing about, well, you give each party the week to kind of go for it. I think that's all changed.
I think that changed a while ago.
Well, I think it did change a while ago, and the reality is that I think the Conservatives have... Look, yet again, just looking at the headlines there, you see the advantages if you've got most of the press kind of ready to beat your drum. I mean, she said...
The Guardian
she said
she's got the centre ground.
She
wait
a minute. No, wait a minute. What they say is that she's trying to stake out the centre ground. Ultimately, it's about what you then do in terms of policy.
Of course.
And I think that is when it will get difficult, because I think a lot of Tories who have sort of kept quiet this week, I think there's quite a lot of Tories who are very, very unhappy about the way the Brexit thing's playing out.
Yeah, sure, and we'll talk about that too. But we are looking at Labour's response to what has happened. As I say, nothing from Jeremy Corbyn and MPs who are admitting that she is, in terms of talk of fairness, in terms of talk about working people, the party of the workers, from a rhetoric stance.
Oh, yeah, but you've got to be careful, because the thing, people can criticise New Labour and Tony Blair all they want, but the thing we did was we set out a strategic course, New Labour, modernisation, and then we made sure that the policy worked for that. And I just think with Theresa May, she's sort of pointing both ways at the moment. And I still, I see several of the papers today saying we're now really see what she stands for. I'm still not 100% sure what she stands for at all.
Let's talk about Jeremy Corbyn. What is your view of him now? Now he's back in power. Now he is the leader again of the Labour Party.
He's the leader of the
but he
Labour
is in terms of the Labour Party.
Yeah.
Is your objection to him one of policy-based or competence?
I've always believed that the policies and the politics that the Labour Party has to pursue to win power, which is a legitimate and necessary aim, that I think you've always got to be in touch with the people who don't live inside the political bubble, who do live in the centre ground. And I worry that on policy and on politics, and by that I mean this whole kind of the idea of turning the Labour Party against against the different wing against wing.
He's massively increased the membership.
I know he's increased the membership.
These are your voters.
I know he's increased the membership. Well, a lot of them are people who didn't vote for us. Now, we need new voters, but there are people who are now fairly senior in terms of setting the direction of the Labour Party, who actually have historically always been hostile to the Labour Party. Now, I think on policy there are fundamental disagreements, but I think he's saying a lot of the right things.
Right.
I do think that.
So you think it's a competence issue?
No, I think at the moment it's like, I mean, I saw Kerry McCarthy, the MP, did an interview, and she said, I want to hear stuff that you can't just fit on a T-shirt. It's like I've said, the same criticism of Theresa May. It's about policy in the end, not just
you were
about
all
messaging.
about slogan politics too at the time.
No, but we did the policy,
but,
Joe.
Fine, no, but we don't know yet, do we?
Right, and it's time to start. The conference should have been the time to start setting that out.
But Owen Smith said this morning that he believes Labour should be, and still is in his mind, a centre-left party. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
That it should be centre-left?
Yes.
Now, if you like the policies of Jeremy Corbyn, then surely you can work on the politics or the competence, and he could be a future Prime Minister.
Well, he could, but the point I'm making to you is that you can't just... What I felt about the Labour Party conference is that it felt almost like it was operating inside its own bubble, and it's about the public in the end. That's what, I mean, Theresa May, I don't think, has put forward the policy platform. And I think once she starts to take us down this Brexit path, I think she's got all sorts of obstacles. But I think for Labour, we seem to be, the Labour Party, the Labour leadership seems to be defining itself as much against Labour as against a government that is doing all sorts of terrible things.
Was Owen Smith the wrong candidate to go up against Jeremy Corbyn?
Well, he was the candidate who went up.
Sure,
I mean,
but was he the wrong one?
Well, give me the alternative that might have been there.
Well, there were plenty of people to choose from.
There might have been, but they didn't get nominations.
Right.
So you've got to deal with what you've got. And the reality is he's lost. Jeremy has won. And now the Labour Party, the PLP, once Parliament comes back, they're going to have to make a decision about how they work with him to try to take us forward at a time when people do sense a vacuum and are worried about what this government's doing.
Now, it's time for our daily quiz, and the question for today is, what has Jeremy Corbyn been buying this week? Was it A, Marrows? Thank goodness for that. B, knitwear. C, a new bicycle. Or D, a new tracksuit? Alistair Campbell says he already knows the answer, but he'll have to wait till the end of the show to give it to us. Now, conference season is a tough time for politicians, their phalanxes of advisers, and, of course, us, political hacks. The endless rounds of talks, press appearances, late nights and, of course, cheap wine and terrible fried finger food. What's wrong with that? And though everyone else might have a bit of a conference hangover and there's still the SNPs to go, Theresa May and her kitchen cabinet haven't been indulging. Instead, they've been hard at work, clearing out the Conservative policy cupboards. And over the conference season, they've detoxed the previous administration's big ideas and introduced a new policy regime. The first thing the government announced was a plan to be Brexit ready by next year, promising to trigger Article 50 by March. They also announced they'd blitz existing EU law with a Great Repeal Bill, turning European legislation into British law so it can be sieved out by government. Theresa May vowed she'd keep the UK out of the European Court of Justice and wouldn't hand over any control on immigration, a nod to future negotiations over access to the single market. Home Secretary Amber Rudd picked up on the immigration theme, promising a more British menu. She said she wants firms to list all their foreign employees and employ more local people. The government was also keen to bulk up its fibre content, pledging £3 billion for a home building fund, though not all of that is new money. And of course, the government has done its best to cater for fussy eaters in education, repeating its mantra to allow more selection of pupils with new grammar schools. Although it's not a medical concept, the government doesn't want you to detox without supervision. Jeremy Hunt has announced an additional 1,500 doctor training places per year and called for less reliance on foreign staff in the NHS. But health guru Chancellor Hammond has warned about overdoing it. He's poured George Osborne's promise to get rid of the deficit by 2020 down the sink. Well, we're joined now by the Conservative MP Kwasi Kwarteng. Welcome to the programme. Let's talk about those announcements on immigrants and foreign workers. Are you 100% comfortable with the government's approach and tone?
I think the first thing we have to understand, forgive me, is that it's a consultation. And actually, it's not as radical a policy as people are making. I mean, clearly the media, some elements of the media are very excited about it. But listing foreign workers is something that happens in the United States. The actual policy referred to non-EU migrants and not EU migrants. Yep. So it's not as controversial a policy as forgive me, Alistair.
Are you happy with naming and shaming companies who employ too many foreigners, making a distinction between British-born workers and foreign workers? Are you comfortable with it?
I think there is not a problem with saying
it doesn't cross a line.
We need to look at British workers. It was, after all, your own Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, your friend, who said British jobs for British workers. And now it's so interesting to see people like Alistair, who were defenders of Gordon Brown, now saying that this is the most extraordinary policy. I think it's perfectly legitimate in the light of the Brexit vote to look at developing homegrown skills and finding employment for people in Britain.
Yes, I mean, he coined the phrase, British jobs for British workers. And actually, Ed Miliband went further. He wanted to survey employers and report them to the job centre if they had over 25% of migrant workers. Now, I'm not saying that's wrong, but it's totally unfair to say with shock and horror that this is patently xenophobic.
Well, if you get the next volume of my diaries, which is not yet out,
no,
not this
please.
one.
No,
Wait a minute, let me tell you, because I think you'll find I wasn't terribly happy about British jobs for British workers.
You weren't happy
No,
with
I wasn't.
Right.
Because I thought that was then. The thing about this debate around immigration, and actually this does come through over the last few years, I think we recognise the growing political problem and struggle with the solutions. And I think once you locate the solutions in kind of angry, divisive rhetoric as opposed to policy that might actually work, then I think it gets very difficult. And that's what happens at party conferences.
I think the policy, Claude, you're right, there's a platform in party conference. But there is also, I think, a legitimate reason to look at the policy. I mean, you said yourself, both parties in government have failed to really address this issue. I mean, we want to reduce the numbers. And if you are going to reduce the numbers, and you're serious about that, you've got to look at interesting and very tough policies.
So you do accept that the numbers have to be reduced dramatically?
We all do.
Well, when you say you all do, does everybody in the Tory party?
I think a large majority of the Conservative Party thinks that it should be reduced.
And so these are policies... Right, well, hang on, we'll come on to that, because you talk about the policy solutions.
Yeah.
Would those policies... So, for instance, having fewer foreign doctors, being self-sufficient in British doctors, is that going to help our NHS or hinder it?
I think it can help it. I think it can help
it.
How? Well, there's always going to be a tension between freedom of movement and economic growth. If you wanted economic growth, regardless of freedom of movement, this country could have a population of 100 million. You could have millions and millions of people come in here and they would drive economic growth. But of course, as a politician, you can't responsibly accept that. You've got to have some degree of control. And what we've learned over the last 10 years, look at Europe. There are far-right parties who are growing, they're mushrooming in Europe.
Sure.
Precisely because of this issue. And it's absolutely responsible. The right thing for a government to do is to look at this issue and try and restrict and
Is that the
control it.
solution, though, or is the solution a funding solution?
No, I don't think
Is
it's
it
a
actually about the number of foreign doctors? Isn't it just about the number of doctors? Wherever they come from, but the issue is a funding shortfall.
I think both elements are important. I think funding is important, obviously, with the National Health Service.
Right.
But there's also an issue in terms of giving opportunities for people in Britain to contribute to British society. There's no real social benefit, I think, to importing hundreds of thousands of people every single year and displacing people who are homegrown people.
What's wrong with
jobs.
that? What's xenophobic, as you said at the beginning of the programme, about that?
What I said was, I felt was xenophobic was day by day through the conference week, that there was a clear, deliberate effort, Hunt, then Amber Rudd and partly the Prime Minister herself, to make this the kind of theme for the conference in a way that actually, without bringing forward policy, I don't think this foreign workers listing thing will actually happen. I think it was all part of a positioning. And I think with the health service, I mean, there's Jeremy Hunt. He's got an awful lot on his plate in terms of the health service. An awful lot that he could have made the big issue for his conference. And he focused on this, I think, quite narrow point. I was in hospital a couple of years ago in the Royal Free. I came back from the Balkans and had dysentery. I tell you, if you pushed out, and let me tell you, a lot of people.
But they're saying that they want to develop and home grow British doctors.
And that's a good thing. They can do that anyway. It's the fact that they're trying to pit them against doctors who are already there.
So is this more about rhetoric and positioning than actually pushing through with these kinds of policies?
I think there will be. I mean, I don't happen to share Alice's view. I think there will be some attempt to bring about policies. I mean, that's what governments do.
All right.
It's not simply a rhetorical exercise.
But I think training more doctors is a good thing to do.
Sure.
Could have done that anyway.
All right, well, let's talk about low-skilled workers, because Theresa May said, I know a lot of people don't like to admit this. Someone who finds themselves out of work or on lower wages because of low-skilled immigration. Is that absolutely true? Is that based in evidence?
But, Jo, there is an issue. We've just had a Brexit
hang on,
vote.
I know, but that's not what I asked you. Is it actually true? That's a cast-iron fact, is it? Where is the evidence?
Well, I'm as a constituency MP, I speak to people who are builders all the time.
Sure.
And they will tell you, and you probably had the same conversations, that they haven't had a wage increase for 15 years. Now, a part of the reason for that is because we're importing low-skilled people who are doing those jobs. That's a fact. I mean, we wouldn't import them if they weren't keeping the wages down.
Right, and so
companies wouldn't make profit.
It is addressing a reality. Even Ed Miliband admitted this as a reality. So again, for Labour to shy away and sort of point the finger and say these are issues that aren't actually going to solve any of the current problems.
I think the undercutting of wages is a real issue. And, you know, minimum wage, living wage, these things are all designed to help, but people break the law.
That's right.
But I think what we've got to be very, very careful about, and this is why I was worried about the tone of the whole week, is making policy solutions without really setting out the reality based on data about how big a problem is. And I think I do worry that particularly if you think about the country was very, very divided in the Brexit vote. And the message coming out from Theresa May at the conference is, well, it's not divided at all. 52% gave a very, very clear message about it. And actually, it wasn't that clear. It was very complicated. And I think she should be doing more to unite. And she's making the same mistake as David Cameron made after Scotland.
Do you think it's too binary? I mean, do you think that is too binary? I mean, for instance, she also sees a greater role, which perhaps was one of the more interesting things about her speech in terms of government intervention, about good government. I mean, people were surprised to hear that from a Tory Prime Minister. Is that something that you would support, more government?
Can I just address Alice's point? Of course, a referendum. We don't have them often in this country. There's a reason why we don't.
Because they're a bad idea?
No, but they're binary. It's a yes and no answer. And in a yes and no answer, you're going to get 52, 48 or whatever. It could have gone the other way. And that's a difficult position, I think, for any government to be in. But I think Theresa May has done a fantastic job in actually trying to project a steady government, a mature government.
And embrace
and embrace, you know, she's a national figure. Her polling is very strong.
Sure, but do you embrace, then, this side of her, this state intervention?
I think
good government. Government is the answer.
I think the point she was trying to make, and she has made very effectively as far as I'm concerned, is that there were people who felt left out. we got to look at the Brexit vote and say, look, there are people for whom this economy isn't working. And she says she's going to make an economy work for everyone.
And you think having more government will do that?
That means some more government legislation, looking at workers' rights, looking at things relating to, education.
So you've been converted, Kwasi Kwarteng?
No, I have to look at what the policies...
Well, the conversations I had with you in the past, you would not have naturally signed up to.
You know that I am... I tend to be on the more sort of free market side of things, but... we have to look at the proposals as they come. I think the government has made a very, very good start. I think she's acknowledged what a lot of people, I'm afraid, on your side haven't acknowledged, that there's a real disconnect between the establishment, the metropolitan elite and the country.
I think this metropolitan elite thing is...
it's true. You and I are members of it.
But also the Tory party that all week presenting itself as the sort of party of the working classes, I think we're putting up straw men here. The thing about patriotism this week as well, that you're only patriotic if you follow this vision that Theresa May set out for what Britain is. It's nonsense.
I think she's done a very good job of projecting herself as a national leader, and that requires...
That's a different thing.
Just very briefly, then, are you also signed up to abandoning the deficit reduction plan or reaching a surplus, certainly by 2019-20? Is that something you support?
I am a total deficit hawk, OK? But I came into Parliament in 2010, and you will remember, and we said we would eliminate the deficit in 5 years. We missed all those targets. Yeah. So I think Hammond's approach is much... converted on that too? No, Hammond's approach is much more realistic. He's saying, I want to reduce the deficit, but there's no point in having targets, Joe, that you miss every year.
Like the immigration target?
There's simply no point in that.
Like the immigration target? Is it worth
any target,
that too?
If you're going to have a target...
Or their NHS target.
If you want to have a target, you've got to stick to it. And that's what the Chancellor has recognised.
Kwasi Kwarteng, thank you. Now, Brexit... Oh, no, you're going to stay on for a little bit longer. Now, Brexit has been the hot topic of this party conference season. But what did the delegates at the Conservative conference think the outlook for the UK economy will be in a post-Brexit Britain? Here we go. We sent our Adam out with his balls to ask them.
Will dissolving the UK's marriage with the EU leave the country feeling richer or poorer? Let's find out.
I think richer in the long term, but there's a lot of challenges ahead.
Oh, so richer and poorer?
I think there'll be some people who are a little bit better off and some people a little bit worse off. But I think
two balls then,
I think.
Yes. Go ahead. Richer and poorer. Quick question, aren't you at the wrong conference?
That's a very good question. I better welcome you than I do the Labour Party one.
Oh, richer, definitely. Just having our own seat at the top table again.
I think we won't notice it this early on, but eventually it will become significantly richer.
Well, I think we are going to be poorer.
Right.
So, because we haven't left yet, so we don't know yet. So
why do you think it will lead to us being poorer?
Because I don't think we're going to negotiate the right deal.
Richer, absolutely. If we get that fair immigration system, which is basically anyone from either Europe or outside of Europe coming to Britain with no discrimination based on colour of passport, it's going to make us richer. Better workforce.
OK, go for it then.
Thank you very much.
Be richer or poorer?
Absolutely richer, 100%.
What, 100% richer?
Absolutely, I have no doubt about it.
What will
Best decision we've ever made.
Will be 100% richer?
Well, roughly, yeah, absolutely.
Wow.
I think in the long term we'll probably be richer, but there may be a period of turbulence.
Is the turbulence a price worth paying?
I think it has to be.
Andrea, you're going to love the question today. Will Brexit leave us richer or poorer? Oh, she's not denying it would leave us poorer. Is that how we interpret that silence? Owen, is Brexit going to leave us richer or poorer?
Much richer.
What do you think Andrew Mitchell will vote?
I think Andrew Mitchell will vote richer.
We've seen the country before. We're old enough to remember it before the first referendum.
Oh, we weren't very rich in the 1950s, were we?
We had a good life, even though we were children then.
I'd say probably slightly on the poorer side.
Why is that?
Because it'll take us a bit of time to get back into it.
Brexit? Yeah. You've heard of Brexit, yeah, I'm guessing? What is it even? No one's talking about it. Is Britain going to be richer or poorer as a result of Brexit? Don't you want to answer that question? Oh, he's got time to do a selfie, but not a time for the mood box. Sad. There we go. Which one will he go for? Emphatically richer.
Correct.
Aren't you quite rich already?
I poor.
Why'd you say that?
I just think culturally, I think it's going to be a big mistake to have left and make ourselves more isolated from the rest of the EU.
There we go, last mood box of Tory conference, and it's a whopping majority think that Britain will be richer as a result of Brexit. Kerching.
Ka-ching. Kwasi Kwarteng is still with us. Well, you saw their clear majority.
Absolutely.
You agree with them?
Completely.
But what sort of long-term, what sort of time span, rather, are we talking about?
I was just reading, just before coming to the show, a guy called Matthias Döpfner. You probably haven't heard of him.
No.
He's the head of Axel Springer. He's a German industrialist.
Yeah, well, I know Axel Springer, yeah.
He said that within 5 years, Britain will be richer, will be doing better than the rest of the EU.
Oh, yes, he did say that.
That isn't a conservative. That's a German businessman who said that.
Yes, he did. You're right. Between
absolutely.
3 and 5 years. But beyond that, do you think that's true, or do you think it'll take longer?
I think 3 or 5 years. I think the economy can adjust very quickly. I think we'll have different trading patterns. Of course, we'll have a relationship with the EU. No one is saying that we're going to, draw up a drawbridge and isolate ourselves.
No, sure. I mean,
but I think that broadly we'll have more control. We will have a flexible, more flexible economy,
and that will make us richer in the long term.
I mean,
you've mentioned Döpfner from Axel Springer, but of course you know that there are big employers, Nissan,
sure.
Jaguar Rover, about risks to jobs of Brexit.
I mean, it's legitimate.
Are they wrong?
They are producers. They are people who make things in this country, and they have a vested interest in the status quo. Absolutely. And I would expect them, at the beginning of negotiations, to set out their stall and say, look, these are the dangers.
But they have a vested interest in access to the single market.
Yeah,
which was in your manifesto.
We can have access to the single market. We're talking about membership of the single market, and Theresa May's pretty well said that's not going to happen. You could still have access and still manage to get much of what we have.
We don't know. The thing that we don't know.
We don't know.
And also, I think that having triggered having said she's going to trigger Article 50, that's when the tough stuff's going to start.
Right.
That's when these negotiations are going to get very, very difficult.
Now, is this you doing Project Fear again? Is this you warning about the economy taking a downturn from March?
It's me warning about what I think will happen, which is that the European Union are going to see us now as a... People keep talking about this as a divorce. It's a resignation. We've decided to leave.
But it's not.
And the European Union, we have...
They're going to punish us. Is that the idea?
No, but
is that a threat?
It matters much more to us than it matters to them, is all I'm saying.
Let me say this. We are about a sixth of the economy of the whole EU. There is no sense in them having a retaliatory tariff.
It doesn't have to be retaliatory.
Or some crazy kind of.
It's going to take us years and years.
It's not going to take
trade
years.
deals we need.
It's not going to take years. You were very much in favour of the euro, as I remember.
No, I wasn't in favour of the euro. I've always been in favour of the EU.
Tony Blair was in favour of the euro, and that we were told would be a disaster if we didn't join. It's been the best thing this country.
Right. Well, hang on. Let's look at what people within the government are saying.
Sure.
I mean, Philip Hammond, the Chancellor, repeated this week the Treasury forecast that was done during the referendum campaign of a 4% hit over time to GDP. Now, he repeated it again this week. I mean, is he right?
I don't happen to believe any of these scare stories, because like a lot of the people...
the Chancellor is scaring people.
Well, they I don't know what his particular position was. Certainly before the referendum, we had a lot of data.
But he said it again this week.
We had a lot of data from the Treasury. We had even the punishment budget. We all remember that had a Treasury thing. And
that was all wrong, wasn't it?
It was all completely wrong.
But listen,
it was false and wrong.
No, wait a minute. What Philip Hammond was doing, it seemed to me this week, and I find it incredible that I'm sort of looking at Philip Hammond and thinking, seems to be a voice of almost reason within the whole setup.
Well, he was a Remainer.
Yes, but he's now the Chancellor. He's actually looking at this data the whole time. And I think that this stuff, the idea, the trouble we've got is a media which created this sense of everything's going to be wonderful, now wants to be proven right.
It's going to be...
And so they pick on every single little piece of economic data.
But just as your side picked on the data that showed
yes,
it was
fair
wrong.
enough, I accept that.
But
my point is that the big, difficult stuff is yet to come. It's going to come when these companies do make their hard-headed decisions. And the idea that they're all going to say, oh, that's fine, that we can have access to the single market, don't have to worry about freedom of movement.
Well, they might.
We are going to face some very, very difficult choices.
But I just want to say to you, you talked about Philip Hammond being this voice of sanity, but it was also the same voices, including yours, warning of apocalyptic style economic downturn. That was wrong, wasn't it?
No, I don't accept that. It hasn't even begun.
No.
But you warned about it immediately.
Very clear about this. These people said there would be a recession in 2016. Thankfully, that hasn't happened. That is a falsifiable statement.
We're still in 2016,
That's true, and I'm touch wood. We're not through the woods.
So you don't envisage a recession?
I don't think there'll be a recession this year.
Do you envisage a recession?
No, wait a minute.
Right. Okay,
don't point to me as these people. You're talking about Cameron and Osborne.
And the banks, and a lot of banks in the city.
I said, and I still believe, that I think leaving the European Union will damage us politically and economically and culturally.
And
that's what I said. And I think
we'll see. And the majority of people
but can we agree that we won't really know until Article 50 is triggered in March, and then we might have a clearer idea?
We're not going to know.
It'll take years.
It'll take years. I mean, obviously.
So it will
it's like
take
the man
years
who was
to get the
told,
trade deal.
it was like the man who said, what's the effect of the French Revolution? It's too early to tell. We don't know what's going to happen in 5, 10, 30, 40 years. What we do know is that I think that the longer the time goes on, I think a lot of your Project Fear stuff, your doom mongering, will be proved wrong.
All right.
And the newspapers will say that Brexit, booming Britain is still going
Absolutely.
strong.
Well, while you blame the
as we're in
newspapers,
sackcloth.
We used to work in the newspapers.
I know, I'm out of it, thank God.
I'm ending this conversation. Quasi-Kwarteng, thank you. Now, to something that has just come into us. We're hearing reports that UKIP's immigration spokesman, Stephen Wolfe, who announced he would be running for the leadership of the party, because there will be a contest following the resignation of Diane James, has this morning collapsed in the European Parliament in Strasbourg. Well, we can now talk to our political correspondent, Alex Forsyth. Alex, tell us what's gone on.
Well, this is very much a developing story at the moment, Joe, but we know the first reports came in about half an hour, 40 minutes ago, that Stephen Wolfe had collapsed, left a vote in the European Parliament in Strasbourg, which is currently sitting for its plenary session, and collapsed. And then we've had confirmation from a UKIP spokesman that he was taken ill suddenly in Strasbourg and has been taken to hospital for tests. We haven't got any more information at this stage about the severity of this incident or what's happened. No further update on Stephen Wolfe's health, but as you might imagine, other MEPs and UKIP colleagues are tweeting their support for him. Even his rivals in that UKIP leadership contest are saying they wish him the very best for a speedy recovery. Stephen Wolfe, as you say, was doing the media rounds, if you like, yesterday when he declared that he would be a candidate in this UKIP leadership race, saying that he was the first one to put his name forward now that the contest will be rerun following that unexpected resignation of Diane James. And then this latest development today that he has been taken ill. But as I say, very scant details at the moment about exactly what's happening with Stephen Wolfe and how severe this may or may not be.
Yes, and I suppose the leadership contest then at the moment will be put on hold until certainly we know what about Stephen Wolfe's condition.
Yeah, well, the only other candidate so far to have declared that he will be standing is Raheem Kassam, who is a former advisor to Nigel Farage, the interim and former UKIP leader, and he has tweeted saying that out of respect for Stephen Wolfe at this stage, he's not going to continue with media appearances until the situation becomes a little clearer. And across the board, across UKIP, which we know has had lots of infighting and division, there seems to be broad support, of course, for Stephen Wolfe, who is a very well-known character in UKIP, somebody who's been their immigration spokesman and an MEP in the Parliament. So people across the board are saying they wish him all the best and hope he gets well. But at the moment, it seems there's certainly a pause in any campaigning while people work out exactly what's going on.
Alex Forsyth, thank you for updating us. And we were hoping to speak to Raheem Kassam, also going to stand for the leadership. But as we've just heard, no more media appearances for the moment, as it's not particularly appropriate, bearing in mind Stephen Wolfe's condition. Now, as well as attacking the socialist left in her speech, Theresa May also rejected the ideology of the libertarian right. Unsurprisingly, it hasn't gone down well with everyone on the right. Let's have a listen to what she had to say.
It's time to remember the good that government can do. Time for a new approach that says, while government doesn't have all the answers, government can and should be a force for good. That the state exists to provide what individual people, communities and markets cannot, and that we should employ the power of government for the good of the people. Time to reject the ideological templates provided by the socialist left and the libertarian right, and to embrace a new centre ground in which government steps up and not back to act on behalf of us all.
Well, joining us now is the Deputy Editor of the Daily Telegraph, Alistair Heath. Proud libertarian, I would say.
Indeed.
Well, your worldview's been rejected completely by Theresa May.
It has indeed. But look, let's be. I mean, that's exactly the point I made in a piece today. But yes. I think it goes broader than that. I think for years now, the Conservative Party and also the Republicans and Americans have been moving away from the ideas of Thatcherism and Reagan and the ideas of people like Hayek and Friedman. And what she did yesterday, I think, was quite important. It was an official rejection of that worldview. So it's building on what's happened in the past. It's building on what happened under the coalition, because you had lots more labour market regulation, lots more taxes and all that sort of stuff. But it was more comprehensive and it was more explicit than anything I've ever heard before from a Tory leader. And in many ways...
Yeah, in many ways.
I mean, in many ways, it's a kind of worldview that Lord Heseltine would have embraced. It's an aggressively interventionist government. It's about an industrial policy. It's about the state doing things and trying to, you know...
But that's because she feels she's right about it, that she's more in tune with public sentiment, that actually people like you, who are supportive of bankers and big business, rightly or wrongly, global elites, which motivated many people to vote for Brexit, are just completely out of fashion and people feel have done a lot of harm.
Yes, well, I backed Brexit, of course. But you can back Brexit and be in favour of free market capitalism.
But that's the conundrum, isn't it?
Well,
but do you agree
it's what she thinks is a conundrum, yes. And I think quite a lot of people think it's a conundrum. But we shouldn't forget from the start that the biggest single group of Brexit voters were Tory voters, right? So something like 60% or 61% of Tory voters voted for Brexit. Of course, a lot of Labour voters did. A lot of course, almost all UKIP voters did, and a lot of them are former Labour voters. But it's wrong to see Brexit purely as a populist rejection of globalisation. It's not that. Some aspects of it were that, but other aspects were not. And people like myself, who've always been free marketeers, also rejected the EU for completely different reasons.
But has free market, deregulation, has it not failed in the eyes of so many people?
I mean, obviously, I disagree with that. And
yes.
I think that there's massive problems in society. You've got things like a housing crisis, which you talked about. You've had a massive productivity problem.
You're going to do state intervention.
You've got stagnant wages and so on. I just think the answers are not state intervention. They're about finding market solutions to these problems, finding conservative solutions to these problems. It's a kind of, the kinds of solutions that Thatcher and Reagan would have tried to find for these problems. But of course, this does show that the kinds of ideas I like are on the wane, and I hope it won't last.
Right. Are you happy about that? Are you happy that Alistair Heath is out on a limb, isolated on the edge of what is now mainstream politics, and again, that the Tories, the Conservatives, are occupying good government, state intervention, all the things Labour leaders have long since loved?
Yeah, I mean, I think Alistair's slightly overdoing the doom and gloom from his side of the argument. I think what you saw yesterday was Theresa May feeling under competing pressure, and actually her speech reflected the same backdrop as Jeremy Corbyn's did, was essentially saying that the public feel that the crash, those who caused the crash, have kind of got away with it. And those
do you not think that's true?
I do think that's true. I think that is why. I think that's what fuels a lot of the kind of anti-politics feeling, anti-government feeling, anti-business feeling. I think where she's got to be very, very careful is in where she ends up. Because once you're the Prime Minister, you can't sort of be all things to all men or women repeatedly. Yesterday she did a little bit for Labour voters, a little bit for UKIP voters. I don't think actually that she's as committed in the way that Alistair seems to think to a rejection of right-wing Thatcherism.
Does that reassure you, Alistair?
Well, I'm a very optimistic person, so there you go. But look, I think to me one of the key points is this. We are going to have Brexit. I'm very happy that we're going to have Brexit, and I think May will negotiate or try to negotiate the best possible settlement. But for Brexit, for the opportunities of Brexit to be realised, you need a very competitive economy. You need free market reforms. You need to attract capital.
Right.
And this is key. So the Prime Minister needs to remember that, the government needs to remember that, and bashing business all the time and calling for much greater state intervention and saying that, businessmen created all sorts of problems.
It was a much more populist speech than I expected, both on left and right of the argument.
Yes.
Right, but on the conundrum that I was talking about, isn't that the problem? Remainers would say that there were two types of people who voted for Brexit. People like you who actually believe in more globalisation, more deregulation, and the power of the free market, and many people who voted for exactly the opposite, but still voted for Brexit.
Yes.
How is she going to be able to marry those two?
But the reality, of course, is the Remain side was also a coalition, right? It was a coalition between people who loved the EU, but people who didn't like the EU but were scared of leaving, and people on the left, people on the right. So you had referendums about coalitions. You had two coalitions. And, of course, it's quite difficult to reconcile those two, but what she needs to do is create an economic success story. She needs to trigger economic growth, she needs jobs, she needs investment, she needs rising wages. If you start to achieve these kinds of things, and if you're also more democratic, and if you reject certain aspects of the old kind of elite rule, then I think you can make some leeway and you can start to grow your share of the vote. And I think she could get quite a lot, over 40% of the vote, in theory at least, with those sorts of policies. I don't think she needs to engage in a wholesale rejection of Thatcherism and free market economics.
Right. I mean, and Labour has to be careful about bashing bankers and bashing business. That was Ed Miliband's big problem before Jeremy Corbyn, was being seen as the anti-business party and not about economic growth. So, again, you do have to tread a fine line if you're going to blame the people who were responsible for the crash.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the worst thing for me in recent years in politics is the fact that the Conservatives managed to pin the causes of the economic crash on Labour, and that Labour actually ventilated that attack rather than challenged it. But I think this discussion is showing the difficulties that she has in terms of where she's going to position herself strategically and politically going forward. I don't think she's rejected a fairly right-wing approach to the economy. I think she's talking the talk of the centre ground, and once we get into the Queen's speech and Parliament's back, we'll see what sort of policies come forward, and that is when I think she'll be tested.
Oh, well, Alistair Heath, we'll wait and see. Thank you.